Hey, morning. Sorry for the delay. Thanks for filling in. We were hoping we'd have a few more people off the metro. So thanks for joining us this morning and for coming for this discussion. We're going to have a fun one. And so I'm A.R. Siders from the University of Delaware, working on Managed Retreat. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator this morning. So I'm going to queue up our speakers, and then they're going to provide us some insight, and we're going to have a discussion, sort of first a moderated discussion, and then hopefully questions and engagement from all of you. And the reason for this session is that there are sessions throughout the last 2 days and today and tomorrow thinking about how we can redesign Managed Retreat into the future, right? What would it look like for a better buyout in New York? What does it look like for a private sector to get involved? What does it look like for a federal engagement and community-driven relocation? We wanted to bring this together to think about what are the roles of some of these different actors in supporting Managed Retreat? How are those roles changing, and how could they change in the future, right? Are those roles what we want them to be, or do we want to see some shift in how people are engaging and how they're designing this? So we have with us today people who are very bravely going to represent different levels of types of engagement with Managed Retreat processes from a variety of aspects, and ask you to not hold them to any, if they speak beyond their expertise, blame it on me because I've asked them to do so. So yes, that's what's happening here. All right, and just to introduce our panel, I'll start from the far left. We have Eric Letvin. He's the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. He directs FEMA's pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs, including the hazard mitigation, pre-disaster mitigation, flood mitigation, and the floodplain management portions of the National Flood Insurance Program and the Community Rating System. And he previously served on the National Security Council and with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and AECOM. Sitting next to him, we have Liz Greenstein, is the Chief Staff of the New York City Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery Operations, initially led Sandy recovery and is now developing plans to pursue resilience in the city for future events. Previously, Liz worked on affordable housing at the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and with the city parks and the Nathan's Coming Foundation. So it'll be very interesting to hear about the intersections with housing and your current work on resilience. Kelly Leilani Main is the Executive Director and founder of Buy-In Community Planning, a national nonprofit, providing voluntary relocation services for communities on the front lines of climate change and pollution. Previously, Kelly worked as a planner, designer, and geospatial analyst in a range of international and US contexts. She's currently completing her doctoral studies at Berkeley, where her research focuses on Managed Retreat and ecosystem restoration. So lots of questions about how the land is used afterwards, I'm sure, are coming your direction. Yeah. And then Patrick Forbes is the Executive Director of the Louisiana Office of Community Development. He oversees the state's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as resilience planning at the state. He also served in the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities and is an environmental engineer previously. And so now I've asked each of them to provide a few minutes on their role in sort of Managed Retreat, both specifically for their agency or organization, but also thinking about the level of the federal, state, local, or nonprofit engagement level, and thinking about how that's changed over time, how it might change in the future. And so with that, Eric, I'm going to put you on the spot as our first responder for the feds.
First responder.
Well, sure. Thank you for having me here today. So FEMA, if you were here at 8:30 yesterday, my boss, Victoria Salinas, was here with Department of Interior talking about the interagency working group that's led by the Council of Environmental Quality in the White House on community-driven relocation, which is the term that that we're using in the White House and the federal government for Managed Retreat. We're talking about the same thing. So FEMA is a co-chair of that interagency working group. We've had a couple of listening sessions recently. So when I attended this conference virtually 2 years ago, I was, I think, one of the only people from FEMA, and there weren't a whole lot of federal folks in the audience virtually. We've come quite a way since then. We have a working group. We're reaching to the outside. We're looking for helping define answer this question: which should the role of the federal government be? What should the role of FEMA be? After the conference 2 years ago, I went back and I run as Siders mentioned, the pre and post disaster mitigation grant programs. I asked a very simple question of my staff that we didn't have an answer to: how many communities has FEMA helped relocate? And it was actually not an easy question to answer, because the community doesn't check a box on our grant application, hey, we're relocating. So I went and looked at academia. There's a paper by Pinter from a couple years ago that analyzed communities that relocate. And we found out that since 1993, we helped relocate about 25 communities and 2,800 structures. Communities identified by Pinter as communities that have either partially or fully relocated. And we have been helping communities relocate since the Mississippi floods of 1993. The Galloway Report, which helped create our post-disaster hazard mitigation grant program. So it is and always has been an eligible activity through acquisitions for both our pre and post-disaster mitigation grant program. So in terms of what our role should be, I'm sure we'll get to that on the panel, but what our role has been to this point, we can certainly say that we've helped at least 24, and I'm sure it's probably more, communities partially or fully relocate, both coastal communities and inland communities. So we have been a funding provider and providing technical assistance for communities who wish to relocate.
I want to push you just a little bit so we know that FEMA is funding buyouts and community relocations. We know HUD is doing some as well. Other federal agencies are providing funding as well. What aspect of this do you think that FEMA is doing particularly well, or what is the strength that FEMA brings, right? Why should FEMA be doing this maybe instead of or in addition to these others?
Well, that's a great question. There is we talked about it a little bit yesterday. There is a General Accounting Office GAO report that came out a couple years ago that actually analyzed and looked at all the federal grant programs and who has funded managed retreat, what should their roles be, and actually that report analyzes between HUD and FEMA. It's a good question going forward. What should be the role? Who has the expertise? Who has the funding? The way our grant programs are structured now by Congress, I tell my staff this, is that, you know, if you look at climate change and future risk, we're trying to accomplish large-scale tasks with programs that were constructed 20 years ago with probably not this intent in mind. So we're doing the best we can with the funding we have. It's, you know, a whole community doesn't typically relocate in 1 year. It happens over multiple years, over multiple grant cycles. We can go in and see that we're doing acquisitions in a certain area. But to answer your question, I think that's a great question to talk about, is what should our role be? I think the advantage that we have at FEMA is we have both pre and post-disaster grant programs. So we have our Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, $2.3 billion we had last year. That's probably more pre-disaster mitigation grant dollars than we've had in the last 10 or 15 years combined. And so I think that a lot of our grant programs in the federal government are structured post-disaster. And unfortunately, you know, the home gets swept, there's a lot of disaster suffering that has to happen before a decision is made to relocate. I mean, I think that one advantage we have at FEMA is we have pre-disaster mitigation grant dollars, and we can help communities who want to relocate in the pre-disaster environment with pre-disaster mitigation funds, excuse me, for planning and whatnot. So I think that's one strength we have at FEMA, is we can do this before an event occurs.
Thanks. Pat, I'll put you on the spot next, thinking about the role of state. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I have been in disaster recovery since 2005 when Katrina hit, and whenever we stood up this team of people, and it was a board and, you know, people from all over the state trying to figure out how were we going to go through this recovery, the first thing is urgency and speed and just getting things rebuilt, right? But we had this motto even then of safer, stronger, smarter. How are we going to do this better? We didn't think about it in context of climate change at the time, because we didn't know we were going to be whacked by successive hurricanes over and over again after that. But at the time, we knew that our current state was very, very locally driven, very hands-off from the state level. And when these huge grants came in for recovery from Katrina and Rita, all of a sudden there was a state decision-making process about what the priorities would be. By and large, we still had sort of a hands-off approach, but even then we insisted, for instance, that everybody adopt new building codes. We didn't even have the international building codes in the state as a requirement at the time. We also insisted that in order to get those CDBG funds and hazard mitigation funds, that parishes had to adopt the advisory-based flood elevations, which are higher and say, just best available science. So we started then to think about what does planning for the future look like, and how do we drag ourselves up, maybe even with other people, other states, I should say. And the other thing about it is that the funding that my agency manages has definitely evolved. CDBG funds, after Katrina and Rita, we were prohibited from spending on anything that was mitigating or not related to addressing the specific impacts of the disaster. It changed a little bit 2008. It changed a lot in 2016, 17, when Congress said, you know what, these disasters are going to keep coming and they're going to keep getting worse, and so we're foolish if we don't start forcing people to spend money on mitigation. We already wanted to, but that wasn't an option at the time. So Congress put in that appropriation a specific mitigation amount. And since then, 2020, 21, 22 appropriations, they have plussed up every grant with mitigation funding. So our role at the state, in Louisiana at least, has gone from almost completely hands-off by virtue of going through all these disasters, and more to the point, having all those funds flow through the state, into more of a planning, a resilience planning agency. Certainly, we've got to get the money out. We've got to rebuild people's houses. We have to build affordable rental housing, and all those things that we do, and we got to do them in a hurry. Unfortunately, we've gotten experienced at that. But we also now have this obligation that comes with those federal funds to look at climate change, how we're addressing that, how we're working within state agencies. That was a huge problem in 2005. How we work with locals, how we work with nonprofits. We've been through that in fits and starts, and maybe learned a little bit sometimes, but not always. We backtrack too. But we have progressively become more and more an agency and at the state level, in broader terms, policy drivers for envisioning a harsher future as weather is concerned. So we've got to, it would still be the case, most likely, that most local governments, if we just said, X parish, you get $1 million, Y parish, you get $2 million, that, but for the sort of parameters that we place around that funding, the capacity building that we build into that funding at the local level, it would not wind up in really resilience building activities. And so our role has really changed towards being a policy driver and coming up with ways to force that policy through the implementation, through the funding. Of course, we now have a state resiliency officer, which we never dreamed of in 2005. that just got codified this past session, actually. But we'll see. We'll see how all that. I don't think that it's written in stone how that will progress from here.
You know, I've heard from some of the conversations yesterday and the day before that one limitation on states taking action is capacity at the state level. It's having resiliency officers, having enough people, particularly enough people, but having enough staff and capacity there. It sounds like that's grown a lot in Louisiana. So I guess it's a two-part question: was it really Katrina? Like, do we have to wait for a disaster to hit another state for those states to build their capacity? And then are there areas where you still want more state-level capacity, like to do more? Yes. Is it still a barrier?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, Liz and I were talking about this just before the session, in the sense that there are states all over who don't have disaster recovery or resilience capacity in place, largely because they haven't been whacked. Louisiana, we get it over and over and over again. So we got 100 and something people in my agency, 100 and something people at GOSEP, and we're all there. And when the next thing comes, it's not that hard for us to sort of absorb that in and keep the other things going. But there are states and cities that don't have that. And we were just talking about how difficult it is to convince people of the importance of having that capacity in place. And so one of the things, interestingly, your question is the perfect lead up. The most recent thing we're doing with mitigation funds is called the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. And we are fundamentally changing the state's approach to flood risk management to make it based on watersheds as opposed to jurisdictional boundaries. And so we've got money to spend, but we say all the time, this is not enough money for us to fix all the problems. It might be enough money for us to figure out how to work together differently to do this better in the future when other funds are there. So we are, I guess to some extent, we are, in fact, we've recognized that lack of capacity and are building it through these regional coordinators and regional steering committees that are built around watersheds to outlive the money, hopefully, and continue to function in a way. And the same thing at state government, developing the plan for how state agencies will work together. Right before we started doing this, Transportation and Development might build a road without ever considering, what that meant to the wildlife and fisheries, scenic rivers or whatever. But yeah, so we've definitely evolved, and again, through the benefit of federal funding and the necessity of doing that.
I think we're going to come back to some of those themes for the whole panel. But first, Liz, I'm going to turn to you next for local government.
So it's always interesting to hear other people's perspectives. So I don't presume all of you are from New York City, but you're here, so welcome. New York City, we are New York, New York. We're different than the rest, bigger and better, which doesn't mean that we know how to necessarily build a better recovery program. But Hurricane Sandy was just over 10 years ago, and almost uniquely, you and your colleagues at HUD would know better, almost uniquely, New York City received an allocation of CDBG, DR funding separate from the state of New York because the scope of the disaster downstate was so significant. There are also some other political reasons, namely the HUD secretary had been my former boss, and we had a whole alignment of people who were pulling in our favor. We offered, as part of the recovery program, which in New York is called Build It Back, we offered a variety of pathways for homeowners to move forward with their recovery process. That included elevating their homes and rebuilds. And then we offered as well an acquisition and buyout program. What's interesting is how our program developed, because initially there was a buyout program offered by the state, by the governor's office. focus exclusively in communities on Staten Island, which is one of, if you're not from New York, there are 5 counties that make up New York, 5 boroughs. Staten Island is one of them. There was it really was a buyout program where entire neighborhoods are now part of mostly parkland. Some of them have gone to the Blue Belt as well. But that program was limited in duration. It was for 1 year, and it was for specific neighborhoods. In response to community demand and from interest across the city developed its own buyout program, which importantly you had, depending on how we looked at the properties and the Department of City Planning's plans for those neighborhoods, the properties were either bought outright and then were moved over to either the Parks Department, Environmental Protection, there are a few other dispositions for that, or that was repositioned as acquisition for redevelopment, which meant that those properties, sometimes it was because you couldn't actually build a contiguous series of lots, and because they were far enough out of the, removed from the floodplain, we demolished the property, demolished whatever was the structure on the property, and then issued them out in the series of RFPs. Some of them were repositioned for affordable housing, some of them were for regular market rate housing, but whatever would have been built there would need to be built sustainably, so it had to be elevated to floodplain regulations. So that's how the program developed. We learned a lot from the New York City context, which I don't know about how this mirrors other communities, but Hurricane Sandy was in 2012. Just historically, that was kind of the end of the mortgage foreclosure crisis, the subprime lending crisis. A lot of the home ownership neighborhoods in New York City lined up very neatly with a map of where the floodplain is and of where Hurricane Sandy struck. We can have a separate conversation about what I refer to as naturally occurring affordable housing, and neighborhoods that are off out of the center of urban settings. However, we had people who were doubly underwater, which is to say they had mortgage requirements and obligations, and they had significant enough flood damage. So the buyout prices we were able to offer were not enough to make them whole, which meant that they could not take buyout because they were not going to be in a position to be able to move someplace else. Layered on top of that, which I think is something that cities are closer to the ground and are uniquely able to respond to, is understanding the larger housing context, particularly in New York City, where, if you also haven't heard, we have, it's a very dense city, we have a housing crisis. It's not uniquely an affordability crisis. We do not have enough units for the people who are here and who want to be moving here. We have the jobs, the state of New York has the jobs, we don't have enough homes for people. So if we were buying people out, even if we gave them additional incentives, which we did offer, we through a subsequent action plan, we were given authority to offer up to 3 different sets of incentives: an additional $50,000 for low to moderate income families, an additional $50,000 to relocate out of the floodplain, an additional $50,000 to relocate within the 5 boroughs of New York City. We had very few takers for those programs. In total, I think separate from the state of New York's program, I think we only had about 100, just over 100 buyouts, acquisitions and buyouts, and a lot of that had to do because the finances didn't work out, and because people didn't have places to go to. I really want us to think about that as well, and as we think about some research opportunities, like the finances of buyout are significant, particularly when you're in a high-cost city. And densely populated and already well-grown. So we've had a unique trajectory in New York. And then I certainly have other things to comment on in terms of what Pat has flagged. Our program until now has been, our office was set up 10 days after Hurricane Sandy by an executive order. We were created as a mayoral office as opposed to a regular agency. And so with the idea being that we were going to pull from a whole lot of different capacities. We brought in initially people who were working in the buildings department on affordable housing, who were working on environmental protection, basically people who could be pulled from their jobs, and then developed our own internal capacity beyond that. But then at a certain point, the money gets spent, and then you have no money. And so, and that's money for basic operations. And so we are at a position where, luckily, unlike Louisiana, New York City does not regularly have large-scale natural disasters. We did have Hurricane Ida just almost 2 years ago, and we are now, the city is now receiving funding for Ida recovery. But there are lean years in between where we've had to request funding from the general taxpayer obligations. And that means we're in competition with other things that need to happen in the city of New York, like getting your garbage picked up and running the buses and any number of other things, museums. And how do you prioritize those things when to the average person, who, particularly those who do not live in the floodplain, they don't see that these issues impact them. And that's a very significant limitation. So Pat is absolutely right. If you do not have there is a great risk, particularly I would say in the Northeast, of, I don't know at the state level, I can't speak for everyone. My hunch is that a lot of us are sort of coasting by with, as soon as hurricane season starts, which was a couple of weeks ago, although in the Northeast it really is August start, we all sort of like start lighting candles and just praying that we'll make it through to Thanksgiving without a big natural disaster. And that's truly not a successful way for building public policy.
Yeah. So given your very personal experience, having worked in housing and now in resilience, I want to ask about this, as you point out, one of the limitations is people finding affordable housing. And I'm sure, Kelly, you see this in your experience as well, and I know others have commented on this as other places. So how are you thinking about connecting housing and managed retreat in New York?
So I'm speaking on behalf of myself.
Yes.
I think one of the things that gives us, I don't want to say power, but really fuels our response is that because we are the city, we really do know what's going on at the local level. And we know that affordable housing is a very real issue here in New York. Again, not unique to New York. It's actually just yesterday's paper. I mean, people are across the country, and it's not even affordable so much. There are not enough units being constructed. There was a big article in the New York Times about across nationally, just not enough starts to keep up with population. So one of the things that, since I spent 9 years working on affordable housing at our affordable housing agency, in other words, working at a HUD-funded agency, when I came to our office, which is a HUD-funded office, I didn't understand that there were like two different parts of HUD and they don't actually talk to each other. I mean, I think they probably meet each other at staff retreats, but there's a real disconnect between the regular CDBG program and the CDBG DR, which personally I think is unfortunate. I think there are ways that we could, especially when you're looking at limited funds, that there are ways that you could you could use different funding sources, not even just the CDBG, but the home and a whole lot of the different programs where you could solve for multiple issues at once. And I think in this managed retreat context, there are opportunities. I'm just, riffing, like, if you have a Section 8 sticky voucher, can you give that to a person as the units are lost, and can they move someplace else with that voucher and still, because they've been, I don't know enough about all the various programs that exist out there, but we need to be thinking much more creatively because our climate refugees within the United States, forget about those people who come to the United States as a result of that, really need to be thought of holistically in terms of understanding the sort of the bundle of issues that they are facing and that we need to address holistically. And I think that really is where the rubber hits the road for a municipality as opposed to any other layer of government.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And now for our non-government organization perspective, Kelly.
Okay. Hi, and thanks again for inviting me to speak on this panel. In terms of, I think, a little bit more about what buy-in is and how it got started. So I entered this space actually before doing my master's in city planning as a anti-displacement and human rights advocate. So I'm from the Bay Area of California. I worked on anti-eviction, anti-gentrification, anti-displacement campaigns. I worked on international human rights campaigns against forced eviction and displacement. And when I came to do my master's and I worked on displacement research, I learned about some really powerful tools that grassroots NGOs, mostly internationally, were using to fight against forced eviction and displacement. And there was a tool that the Housing and Land Rights Network developed called an eviction impact assessment tool, which was used to try to quantify the impacts of displacement on households and fight against large-scale development projects or other, mostly slum clearance and home demolition projects in the developing world. But, you know, after Hurricane Harvey, Matthew, Florence, Michael, Maria, as someone who was working very intimately on the impacts of displacement on households, I also realized that climate change is a displacement crisis, and the failure of government to intervene in the continued emission of greenhouse gases and prevent forced displacement from climate impacts is leading to a large-scale displacement crisis. And as a rights-based advocate, I believe that people have a right to relocation assistance. And if you look at the right to migration, the right to movement, there's a lot of intersections with how a rights-based framework brings a different lens to the way that we think about policy and planning for helping people who are affected by government and economic failures in our society. So that's how I entered kind of climate-related displacement, or this issue of climate migration. And the idea for buy-in also came from a recognition that despite the existence of federal and local and state buyout programs, and some learning, the scale at which we were addressing the problem and the amount of resources being dedicated to the problem was simply not sufficient for the tidal wave of displacement that is very rapidly approaching us. So there were, and I'm a bit of an academic, not like recovering, because I'm still in the academic community. I think
You can never escape.
Yeah, you can't escape it. But there's been a plethora of really incredible research done on all of the problems with buyout programs. We are up to our ears in research about the challenges that buyout programs face, and yet we have very little concrete experience of trying to design new buyout programs like outside of the system. Because a lot of the failures of buyout programs are not, it's not because buyout programs are malintentioned, it's because, as was mentioned before, the policies and the programs and the regulatory frameworks that enable them are not set up to accomplish what we, either as advocates or as people who are interested in social justice and equity and human-centered or rights-based approaches, that's not what the programs were designed to do. So buy-in, I started buy-in with a couple of colleagues with the goal of addressing two of the major failures that we were seeing in the research. One of them was, I would say, a lurking suspicion that I had that there was really an invisible demand for relocation assistance that was not being reflected in a lot of the policy statements and the resilience mantra that says we refuse to adapt to our environmental crisis. We're going to pour more concrete, we're going to elevate more homes, and we're going to kind of ignore the very real circumstance we're finding ourselves in of having to relocate infrastructure and homes and schools and communities away from rising tides and rising waters. And so the first pillar of the work that we do with buy-in is to try to visibilize this invisible demand by making it easier for people to raise their voice and say, I've experienced flooding, my insurance prices are going up, my home value is going down, and I want the government to do something about it. Or not even just the government, literally anyone, right? Like, who will help me? How do I essentially become a part of a movement and also have better access to information? Like, the last thing that someone who is living below the poverty line in a half-destroyed home wants is for someone to give them the HMA guidance handbook and say, well, here's how you navigate a buyout process, right? Like, that is not helpful information. So how do we make the idea of relocation assistance more accessible and become really a place that people can come to for information and then be a part of this growing network of folks that we're trying to support? And the second is also realizing, like, I do not have some sort of neoliberal critique of government, like government can't do anything. I'm trained as a planner. I believe in the power and the role of government. But the problem is that we have bled our public sector dry, and especially at the local level, and especially in impoverished and rural communities, you know, you've got one person who does everything for an entire community of people. I've seen, even in this conference, again, most of the research and scholarship on buyout programs is being done on Sandy recovery. It's being done Harris County Flood Control District, Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Like, I love all of those buyout programs, but the numbers of buyouts that those cities or counties have actually implemented, like less than 5,000. So where's the other 45,000 buyouts that have happened, and who's doing research on them, right? Like, what are the implications at a much larger scale, geographic scale, economic scale, of how buyouts actually happen at the local level? So we formed also to provide robust technical assistance to fill the gap in capacity at the local level. And it was not just kind of like the opportunity or the privilege or the responsibility of being able to read the HMA handbook and say, okay, I think I can figure out how to design and apply for a buyout program so that, you know, town manager in, you know, city population 2,000 doesn't have to, but also based off the work of Binder and Greer, Sherry Binder and Alex Greer on, I love the title of their article, something, and then, you know, are we learning or just failing? And the truth is that from a buyout policy reform perspective, we're just failing. Like, buyout programs are not really changing, and because of the post-disaster funding streams, there's high turnover, we run out of money, there's actually no like longitudinal ability to really develop a national approach to buyouts that works for a whole range of communities. There is no unifying thread. And so by working in a variety of different contexts and connecting communities to HMGP funds, to FMA funds, to BRIC funds, to CDBG-DR funds, to CDBG-MIT funds, can we use EPA funding? Can we use USDA funding? We become like a repository of institutional knowledge, and hopefully in that way can be a much stronger partner in conversations around policy reform and really getting into the details of what regulatorily needs to change versus what is just a matter of capacity or funding.
Thanks for that. So one of the themes that I think is coming through all of your comments is thinking a lot about the role of funding in driving the role of your different organizations and how that funding comes through and drives or doesn't drive. And maybe for Eric and Pat in particular, I'm curious about how you think about, you're providing funding, but you're providing funding with strings. Yeah, funding with a carrot and a stick approach, with guidelines, with some policy recommendations, right? You're eligible if you have a hazard mitigation plan, and that plan must contain certain things. You're eligible if you adopt these certain codes. How do you think about the balance between wanting to provide that guidance to sort of, ensure that everyone is taking strong action, and yet, not overstep and wanting local governments? How do you think about that balance between wanting local governments to take their own actions and yet provide consistent guidance?
I'll jump in. We still, I know that I alluded to the fact that before it was just sort of kind of a Wild West at the local level, and then we started implementing policy from the state level, but the local level is absolutely the best place for decisions to be made about what reduces risk for their citizens. Where are the trouble spots? Where are the places where underserved communities have historically flooded over and over again? We don't know that at the state level. And so that is the balance. You've described it perfectly. How do we figure out how to steer the spending and the activities, consequently, toward things that build resilience, but do that with the help of local knowledge? And so that's, this watershed initiative is one thing we're doing to try to bridge that gap, is to create a functioning organization at the more local level to help understand, as we funnel money down, to have it spent by people who know where it should be spent, where it makes sense, but within the parameters that we've created for that organization.
Putting bounds on things. I
Yes.
see that. Eric, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. So, you know, we have statute, we have regulations, we have policy and guidance. Policy and guidance are things that I can change, fairly easily. Regulations take time, but they can be changed. Statute, I have to go to Congress and, have them change it. So, to answer your question, there are some things that, we talk about requirements that are in the law. For example, you have to have a benefit cost ratio. That is in the law. We provide guidance and training on how to do that, but that's one of those things that's really, challenging to change. The cost share. I don't have the ability to change the cost share from, it's a 75-25%. For most communities, there is a 90-10 for small disadvantaged communities. I don't have the ability to change that. The hazard mitigation plan requirement, that's in our regulations. What we communities are required to update their hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. And I think planning is really the foundation for a lot of what we're talking about here on stage. So if the community, as they update their plan, they are required now to look at future risk and climate change. So I think that's really the foundation for these conversations. At FEMA, just a little bit of a myth I've seen in some papers or suggested that FEMA has a preference on acquisition or relocation or elevation. We don't. It's up to the community to decide whether they want acquisitions, if they want to preserve their tax base and do, we have a program called Mitigation Reconstruction, where you can build another home on the property and tear down the existing one, or whether you elevate that home. One difference between our program and HUD's, this is in our regulation, is that if you use FEMA funds to acquire a property, it has to be essentially forever open space. It cannot be redeveloped. And so I know, like in Louisiana and Monroe County and the Keys and Harris County, they look at, okay, should we use FEMA funds or HUD funds to acquire a property? FEMA, really nothing can be placed there that would be an insurable property. HUD funds, yes, you can actually redevelop that property. So there are some differences between our programs. Some are in statutes, some are in regs, some are policies, some are guidance. To Kelly's point, though, there's a lot of disadvantaged communities who it's a challenge for them to access our funding. We announced a few weeks ago, 46 communities where we're providing direct technical assistance to try to help them. And those are mostly disadvantaged communities and tribes who only have one or two people. So, trying to bridge that gap between how do they access our grant programs. I think just one final thing I'll say that's maybe not taking advantage of enough is we provide both pre and post disaster. We call it advanced assistance or project scoping. If your community is thinking about, managed retreat, and, maybe you don't have all the answers, and you need some money to go out and hire a consultant or a nonprofit or knock on doors and figure out who's interested and how much would it cost, you can actually apply to FEMA pre or post disaster, and we will That's an eligible activity, project scoping. We think we have an idea for a project, but we need some help. So that's something I think is maybe not taken advantage of quite as much. We will provide that seed money to help get you started, and hopefully down the road, that seed money will yield some kind of a project. So I just want to point that out as well, that I think that that's something that could be taken advantage of more. We've made some changes to try to, we've heard from a lot of communities, it's so hard. We have, it's hard doing a benefit cost ratio. It's hard to do a cost estimate, work with a contractor. We'll help you down that road getting started. So between that and technical assistance, I think is how we're trying to reach the more disadvantaged communities and help them bridge the gap of accessing our programs.
If I could amend my answer just slightly, it's not just about placing boundaries on the money, but it also goes to this TA thing. The other thing that we never did before that we're doing now is statewide watershed modeling, for instance, so that everybody has the tools. I always like to say, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to make bad decisions today, but we all do that for lack of information. And so we are trying to create the data, the engineering, the science for people to be able to make good decisions at the local level too, a thing that none of us ever had before. So that's the other key to this. And NOAA at the federal level is now, like, all the models for rainfall and flooding have been based on a static climate. And now NOAA and all the other federal agencies are acknowledging it's changing, and they're about to put out a new rainfall model that says we've got to take into account climate change and how that's going to affect these numbers going forward. We can't assume that we're working from this static historical perspective.
No, absolutely, yeah. It's the one truth about climate change we're all sure of, right? Is the future will not look like the past models. For Kelly and Liz, kind of thinking along the same lines of how you're interacting with other levels of government and building on this regional watershed initiative, I wonder, are we missing a level of government organization here? Is there a benefit to having a regional coordination? Or is that, I don't know, would New York City benefit from having more regional coordination with non-city partners? Kelly, would some of the towns you're working with benefit from having coordination with other towns to think about, whether that's banding together for cost sharing or thinking about property tax revenue? Yeah, curious about your thoughts on, I think some people have proposed more of a regional approach to this. What are your experiences with that?
Different ways I can react. So first of all, it's not like we don't talk to our colleagues at the state. Although there was a period where our governor and our mayor did not get along. For those of you who are from here, I see someone chuckling. We're in a better period now, and even despite those times, on the staff-to-staff level, the people who are at the state's housing HCR are former colleagues of mine from the city, so we all know each other, Anyway, so there's that. So we're not quite so siloed. I was out with some state colleagues the other day, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with, the issues upstate are significant and they're quite different from what we're dealing with here. And we have no expertise necessarily on riverine flooding and then the layers of, employment issues and housing issues upstate. That's all well and good. I do think that we need to be working in a much more coordinated fashion, particularly when it comes to my particular interest, which is the tax revenue implications of moving. That so we have about 500,000 people who live in the floodplain. Hurricane Ida 2 years ago was actually outside of the floodplain, and so we have, separate from the people who are actually living in the floodplain, we've got people who aren't even counted but who are risking displacement. If those people leave New York City, that's a significant hit to our tax base, and which means we really, and this is not unique to New York. This is, I think, these are very real issues when you talk about climate migration, and particularly something as when you're talking about buyouts because of real estate taxes. is there a way that we can share that type of risk and upstate so that we don't uniquely take this hit, but we can come up with some type, I'm making this up, so if there's someone here from the press, please don't quote me on this, but that we can share this type of incentive to keep people as New Yorkers, maybe not downstate New Yorkers, but so that the whole state can stay whole to the way that's, in as much as that is possible. I think those are the types of strategizing we need to think of. At the same time, if I go back to, in a past life, I worked at a large foundation here in New York, and we funded a group here called the Regional Plan Association, where they've been doing these regional plans, tri-state plans, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. And I was like, oh, that's a genius idea. We should be looking at, transit investments regionally, because oh my gosh, like who wants to, New Jersey they don't want to underwrite, the commuter tax. And I mean, what's going on right now with the congestion pricing for Lower Manhattan? Trying to get regions to work together when money is on the line. Like if there was a way to do this, and this is, me being very idealistic, if there's a way to really do this where the money is sort of taken out of the equation, where you can really look in a very meaningful, really deep existential way about what these movements mean for all of us, where the policy sort of gets out of the way a bit, that could be transformational. I don't know that we are there yet. When I think about, Eric talking about the regulations that are in place, as much as, we all, I'm sure he knows this, we all sit in our offices going, oh my God, if I have to deal with another HUD regulation, the truth of the matter is those are not their faults. Our Congress can't get out of its way in terms of the politicization of so many of these issues. So we have a lot to do. I think we would like to be working more collaboratively, but I think there's so much fear, financially driven fear, that makes some of that a leap into trust that some of us are just not ready for yet.
Yeah, I think the question of scale is an interesting and important one, but I think in the work that we do, there's a need to both zoom out and then also zoom in. And when you think about zooming out and thinking either at a citywide scale or county scale or a regional scale, a lot of the questions have to do around things like land use planning, transportation, economic development, affordable housing. Those are planning questions that I think do need to be tackled at larger scales, because an individual buyout, as was mentioned before, can be seen as reducing overall housing stock, disrupting community fabric. And the only way of addressing kind of those negative externalities of the buyout is by thinking about, well, where can new housing be built? Or can we keep people living in this area if they want to stay in the school system, for example, or they want to keep their job? And so that is what is required from planners, I think, both at a municipal level, but also in unincorporated areas, at the county level, and really thinking about the longer term spatial implications of retreat and what it means for where we're building and where we're not building. And in a lot of places, of course, it must be mentioned, we're continuing to build in floodplains. And so the question of how local, at municipal or county level, planning actually changes to ensure that people have a safe, secure, and affordable place to live out of harm's way is really necessary to look at larger scale economic development and housing investment opportunities. But on the other hand, we really zoom in. So I mentioned previously that a lot of the work that we do is inspired by the Civic Impact Assessment. And so we are working with our partners on developing essentially household level surveying that enables the creation of better wraparound services and also the identification of the most appropriate buyout funding source, for example, based off of whether people have insurance or not, or they're repetitive loss property, or they're severely low income and really housing choice constrained in terms of the additional resources, housing supplements or bonuses that are offered through FEMA and HUD programs. And so when we talked about like, what are the different scales of government, I think, yeah, in some ways we're talking about local, regional, state, national, like, okay, that's really, really big. But in terms of decision-making at the community level, there's community-based organizations, there's schools, there's religious institutions, there's social networks of this nebulous idea people have been talking about called community, where there is decision-making power about where people together collectively decide whether they all want to stay together, they all want to leave together, or they don't really care what their neighbors do, and they're going to make a decision on their own. And those realities all exist. So there's no universal sort of community-led process, because in some places the social fabric is strong, and in other places it's not as strong, and people are going to, at the end of the day, make the microeconomic decision that makes the most sense for them. And so zooming in even further, it might just be helpful briefly to talk about the model that we use. So as a nonprofit, we have received grant funding from foundations such as the JPB Foundation, the General Motors Climate Equity Fund, and the work that we do is really enabled through our partners, organizations like the Climigration Network, but in particular the Anthropocene Alliance, which is the nation's largest coalition of frontline environmental justice and climate justice groups. And through conversations with the Anthropocene Alliance, which I'll call A2 for just to shorten from now on, I knew that there were communities that were facing, again, not just industrial contamination, but a lot of flood exposure and concerns about the future. And they said, would you be willing to have a conversation with these community organizations and individuals about what options are available to them? We co-design surveys with our community partners. We pay people the rate that they want to be paid, which in most cases is between $20 and $30 an hour, to co-design a survey. And then our organization hires individual members of the community as 1099 contractors, again, paid $20 to $30 an hour, to go out and do door-to-door surveying of every single house that is located in a floodplain, and creating an extremely detailed and comprehensive picture of where people stand on adaptation preferences, their history of flooding, their mental and physical well-being. Our privacy policy, we own their data, and we have a data sharing agreement with our community partners so that they can use it for advocacy for their local government. So the question of scale, we're not able to really do this scale by ourselves, right? Like, we rely on, and we have the honor and privilege of supporting community-led conversations by bringing resources to the table and helping create meaningful and well-paying contributions to the climate adaptation conversation at the local level. And that is not something that I see government either being willing or able to do. The traditional model of community engagement around climate adaptation and resiliency work is not working. And so we are trying to take a little bit of the inverse approach, which just says, what if we do a whole community approach and use that data to, in some ways, like, engage the government, right? So flipping the idea of community engagement on its head and saying, this is what everyone in the community, these are the conversations people are having with their neighbors, and here are the results, right? Here's what the community has decided that they would like to do.
We're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and while people are formulating your questions and approaching the microphone, I'm going to ask the panelists one last question. Well, unless no one approaches the microphones, in which case I have many questions, which is, well, okay, so maybe for everyone except Eric, although you can weigh in general too, is FEMA the right place for managed retreat? To your point, Kelly, on planning playing a big role or needing housing coordination, as we grow these programs, should FEMA be taking a larger role? Should some other organization be taking a larger role? And even I would encourage you to think about it at your own level, right? Is emergency management recovery the right place at the state level, or the right place at the city level, or the agencies that you're engaging with, Kelly? Where, maybe not vertically, but where horizontally do we think that this should, if we were going to create a sort of unified or a cross-cutting silo or whatever that is framework, where do you think that lives? Go for it, Eric.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I do know is that FEMA will continue to fund, communities relocating either partially or fully. I mean, as I mentioned, there's at least 25 that we've known that we've helped up to this point. But you're looking at a few communities a year, but with our pre and post disaster mitigation grant programs, the number of repetitive loss structures in this country for flooding is going up like this. The National Climate Assessment is coming out this fall. We know, I think somebody showed one of the slides from Zillow, the projections of number of properties are going to go underwater by 2050 is going up. So the programs we have now will continue to be used for this purpose, but I don't think are adequate to really fill the gap of what is truly needed. I mean, so I think the good news is, I mentioned, we have more funding than we've had available in quite some time. I'd say the bad news, like for BRIC this year, record number of funding pre-disaster, $2.3 billion. We were 2 times oversubscribed. So, and that's for all hazards across the entire country. So the programs we have are being highly utilized, and we're funding good projects. But in August, when we announced the projects that are selected for further review, I'm going to have many members of Congress asking me why wasn't my project selected, and I'm going to be like, sir or ma'am, it's because we just didn't have enough money. So what should the role be of FEMA going forward is your question. I got to be careful. I'm in the executive branch of the government, the legislative branch of government. I think we need to solve that. I point you to the GAO report, which we concurred on, which basically says is that there really needs to be a new, single grant program, whether it's FEMA or HUD or, I can't say. We all fund in this space, but I think there's a lot of merits in that report. I encourage you to look at it. And really having a program, like for example, FEMA, we fund a buyout, but we don't track where the people go. That's just not, and luckily a lot of you are doing that. There's some interesting research, some of it just came out this week, but I think a program that really looks from the beginning to the very end of the whole process, that takes housing and mental health and all the things that we're talking about here this week into consideration. We don't have a single program that does that at FEMA or HUD or any agency. So I think there's a lot of merit in that GAO report of really creating a new program. And whether that's FEMA or not, I can't say. I know we will continue to fund work in this space, but our funds are not enough to, from what the climate scientists tell us is going to be the modeling the needs of the future, we clearly don't have enough funding or staff to fund what the nation's going to need.
Can I add into that? His point is, it's not, is FEMA the place? It's, we need more. So the costs are not insignificant. We should assume in New York City, $400,000 to $500,000 per home. New York State, there was a discussion, a panel I sat in on yesterday to talk about the state had here in New York an Environmental Bond Act, which voters voted in. There's $250 million being set aside for buyouts statewide. So if I'm telling you it's $400,000 to $500,000 per home in New York City, that money is being allocated across the state. That's, as the Yiddish phrase is, that's bupkis. It's not going to get us anywhere. So these things really need to, and so one of the things we're looking at in New York City is what other sources do we have? What other, at the federal level, it's beyond HUD. There's also USDA funds. Like, what else can we be using? But we need to be looking in our states and our municipalities for additional funding. I'm interested in what other municipal finance tools might be available. I don't know the answers to that. But also, if the nation is going to be looking at this in a really significant way, this can't be ignored too much longer.
I can just say from the state level, after a disaster, we're working with CDBG DR, CDBG MIT, FEMA PA, FEMA HMGP, FEMA IA, and funds from agencies like NRCS. And it's like a game of Twister to figure out how to meld all these different funding sources together to accomplish the things. It's really about mission, I think. I mean, right now, we're all getting innovative, and we get proud of ourselves when we figure out that we can let NRCS come build a wetland where we bought this neighborhood out, but like that shouldn't be necessary, obviously. It's all about creating a mission for a funding source that is that recognizes all those different pieces. The mitigation from disaster, but I mean, FEMA's mission is helping us get back on our feet after a disaster. It's not necessarily figuring out how communities are going to thrive post-disaster. And anyway.
Yeah, I'll just echo the point that there's just not enough funding being dedicated to this, even with all the pooling and all of these new ideas and initiatives. You know, the estimates are, but from the Union of Concerned Scientists a couple of years ago, were $1 trillion of real estate underwater by 2100. So, you know, they're drops in the bucket. And I think one of the things that's important for framing, especially as we try to work towards recurring revenue streams, using municipal finance or state funding, like revolving loan programs that have maybe fewer strings attached, is that this isn't an all at once you know, it's not like 1 year, we're not going to do $1 trillion worth of buyouts, right? Like wake up and be like, okay, it's $1 trillion. And it's not $250 million through one funding allocation. It's like, it would be much more powerful for the state to support a dedicated fund of $10 to $20 million a year over a period of 10 years or 20 years to allow for institutional growth and learning and development of the program. So I think it's been also very telling in conversations about coordination. It doesn't really seem like any federal agency really wants to coordinate or run the program. Like, just doesn't mean that they don't care about the issue, but it's just outside of everyone's mandate, or it's kind of like working for them to just try to get more communities to participate in what they already have. I don't think that we need an agency to try to build staff, like, to do all of the things. We need a funding stream that people and organizations who are already doing hard environmental and climate justice work on the ground, social justice work on the ground, affordable housing development, they just need access to the resources and they know how to do the work. So I'd say don't reinvent the wheel in the creation of a new agency, but break the cycle of post-disaster and competitive grant programs that make it very difficult for communities to access the dollars, and make a longer-term commitment to recurring revenue and institutional change, because we're gonna need it for decades into the future. So that would be my recommendation.
Thanks. We're gonna turn to some audience questions. Start over here.
Sure, thanks. Judy East, Bureau of Resource Information, Land Use Planning in the state of Maine, where there are 445 municipalities. Half are less than 10,000 people. Probably a third less than 2,000 people, with no staff. Clerks who are there, in some cases, for 2 hours on Thursday night. And I'm wondering about picking up the threads of the regional conversation, much as I adore New York. The comparison to the regional plan organization to most of the rest of the country is not relevant. And so really curious about the watershed approach in Louisiana and this notion of capacity building at the regional level. Yes, decisions come from the local level. They know their own communities, but they have no capacity. And so I wonder if Pat and Kelly in particular could speak to building the regional capacity to help the local communities step up to this question. And just one final plug to Eric. Yes, we've used that pre-disaster scoping money and it's fantastic. But we needed someone at the regional level and a consultant to be able to do it. None of the towns I just described, except maybe a handful in Maine, have a prayer of approaching that. You need that capacity. So if you could speak to that regional level, please. Thanks.
So for Louisiana Watershed Initiative, one of the first things we recognized was that smaller, poorer communities were getting left out of the opportunity to get funding, to do projects, to do smart things. Not that they're not smart, they just, the parish president or the mayor is a pharmacist who, you know, is there a couple hours a week. And so we just funded, we designed the watershed regions around watersheds, go figure, and funded staff capacity, planners, floodplain managers, engineers at each one of these regions, and said, your mission is to to help the folks who don't have staff, don't have capacity, don't have money to go pay a contract engineer to do work for them, so that we could make sure we got projects in from them and that they were included in the watershed planning process. And guess what? We failed first time out of the chute. We still didn't get projects from those folks, even though we tried to design the whole thing to do that. So we gave them more funding so that they could expand their efforts. And we'll see, but the whole thing has been give them the models, the engineering tools that they need, and the staff capacity so that we can bring in all those little villages and towns, because they're affected by the watershed just the same as everybody else in the watershed. So it seems kind of obvious now, but it was not at the time.
Yeah, I think the watershed approach is really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing Louisiana continue to lead in that area. I mentioned from a regional perspective, things like economic development, transportation, housing, et cetera. But if you're talking about a watershed as a region in terms of actual floodplain restoration, overall resilience, water quality issues, I think that there's so much more opportunity and potential when looking at the health of your watersheds and your floodplains, and the role that acquisitions actually play in addressing some of these environmental and water quality issues. The King County Floodplains by Design program that, Anjali, are you in here? I'm calling you out. Maybe she left already. But it's an amazing program that is really working on trying to restore floodplains in Kings County. And it's not approached as like a buyout program, so to speak, in the sense of, well, we need to go get HUD funding or FEMA funding. People just, had their homes damaged. They're saying, well, we have resources at the regional, even at the state level, dedicated to natural resource management, to environmental conservation, to water quality issues. And so they approach floodplain acquisitions from the perspective of this natural resource management. So I'd say, depending on what's possible at the regional or watershed scale in Maine from a natural resources perspective, because I know you have a lot of amazing natural resources out there, that thinking about what other funding can be used to help build potentially pre-disaster resilience, right, or remove structures from the floodplain from the perspective of natural resource conservation and management. But if you do want to look at it from the perspective of having, for example, a single staff person who gets trained on how to apply for all the different grant programs that are available, it really just takes either someone that has experience or is willing to sit down and learn the stuff and fill out a lot of paperwork. Like actually going through the process of applying for a buyout does take a lot of social work and human connection to the homeowners that are participating, but it's also just a lot of administration. And we're trying to develop more streamlined application processes and making it just easier to create the volume of applications needed to apply, but you need to find a dedicated staff person, potentially a new staff person, and have that be 100% of their job all the time if you're gonna essentially run that, rather than asking someone else to add this to their responsibility, their long list of responsibilities that they probably already have. The other person just in the Northeast context, Kevin Geiger at TRROC, which is an acronym I can never remember. He administered the Hurricane Irene buyout program in Vermont, but also does regional planning and addresses exactly some of the same issues that you're talking about, very small communities and the role of regional planning. So we can make that connection. He might have some advice, and they're definitely looking at both acquisitions as well as regional planning considerations as well, if that'd be helpful.
I'm just going to note for those of you watching the clock, that because we started a few minutes late, we're going to run a few minutes late. So so maybe our next question.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Mann. I'm with the Nature Conservancy in California. It's been a really interesting conversation. And Kelly, you were just starting to talk a little bit on my question, but I'm actually curious from the rest of you as well, is how much in sort of strategic retreat work you're thinking about nature-based solutions and ecosystem function and restoration for their risk reduction benefits. I feel like there's been a lot of talk at this conference about how, there might be a big opportunity for more open space for ecosystem restoration in the managed retreat space, but yet it still feels like it's very much an afterthought, something to build after instead of as you are, thinking about retreat in some of these places. So that's my question.
Just from the New York City perspective, so so people know in October, in April on Earth Day, the city released its latest iteration of Plan YC, which is a mandated every 3-year plan of our environmental priorities. Managed retreat is being discussed. So we will be spending the next year sort of figuring out with actually some of our item money, doing a pilot study and trying to build out programs. But that process is actually being led by the city's chief climate officer, who also is the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. And I say that because we are looking at where we would prioritize these areas through acquisition for the blue belt as well as for the green belt. So any property, it would be part of that larger framework. This is not just like it would be intentional if we were going to prioritize neighborhoods, and this is all very much in planning. There is nothing that has been written yet, but the theory behind it would be that it would be acquisition with a planned environmental future towards it. One of the things that, just as an aside, when you look at funding sources for this, is oftentimes the funding sources have put strings on what you can do with that land. So one of the things we've tried to do in the Sandy acquisition program was we realized that we couldn't use certain funds for some of the acquisition that we were doing because they were afraid that we were land banking, right? Which is to say we wanted to hold property because we did not know. If you have people who are giving you parcels and it's a parcel here and a parcel here, and you want to be able to hold that land until you can pull the whole parcel together and then make it all parklands or whatever. HUD doesn't let you do that with the DR funding. And so that meant that as we start looking at future acquisition programs, we are looking at various funding sources so that we can get around some of those obligations or requirements rather, so that we can make sure that land is going towards the best future natural use. In a lot of these places, and I'm assuming we're not unique, some of the properties we're looking at, by the time we get through the purchase process, which takes many years, it's already underwater. So the decision, these are not arbitrary decisions. We know that where nature is going. We have a lot of the planning studies. So anyway, so we are not looking at this just randomly. We do have environmental plans for how this would fit into a larger city landscape.
I wonder if you were a plant from the Louisiana Nature Conservancy, because we actually are contracted with them to. They are in the process of creating a nature-based solutions opportunity tool for the whole state. So it's going to piggyback on the watershed modeling we're doing, and it will present communities with what their best opportunities for nature-based solutions are in the terrain where they live, with the level of development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we are focused on that as part of the solution, just because we understand we're not going to we can't afford to build into a position of resilience.
Thanks. Do you think you want
Can
to?
I still go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Quickly.
So I know the Nature Conservancy in New York is doing some great work on this already, and I'm hoping also that you're connected with the folks over there, but they've looked at things such as a conservation easement, which essentially is a tool that they're using to try to address the waiting period in between a flood event where it's no longer safe for someone to live there, and the actual going through the buyout program itself. So the question of, and again, coming back to this, the role and responsibilities in managed retreat, the waiting period in between when someone decides that they want to buy out for whatever reason that is, and when the buyout actually happens, is a huge opportunity and a huge need for organizations like the Nature Conservancy potentially, or land trusts, land banks, or other organizations that can essentially step in, get people out of harm's way, and go through the waiting period process. Presents a huge opportunity. When it comes to actual like nature-based solutions or thinking about natural systems in this context, I think that the type of ecosystem that you are potentially retreating away from or trying to protect is super critical for conversation. You look at things like in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and you have people who, the sandbar that they built their homes on is moving and they don't want it to move. We have to have a very realistic conversation about whether or not it was ever a good idea to build a community on a sandbar. Like, it is a dynamic ecosystem. So if we want to actually generate respect for the natural environment as a way of addressing the climate crisis, thinking realistically about where we should be building and how we should be building and what a buyout means in the context of restoring that natural ecosystem function, I think is a tremendously underappreciated part of this conversation. On the flip side, there's a really important example from Newport News in the Norfolk area, where a predominantly African American and low-income working class community has, Newport News actually has a locally funded recurring buyout program, and so people have started to participate. And there's been some celebration about, you know, the wetland migration, the marsh migration, and the ecosystem restoration that's occurring. But what we forget is that in a lot of contexts, wetlands and marshes were filled in through urban development, and also because they are breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And so in this particular case, where that from a conservationist perspective, it's wonderful to see the marsh migrating and moving inland and coming back where it used to just be a lawn, is causing serious quality of life issues for the homeowners who have decided to stay. So in the context of wetland or ecosystem restoration, we have to be really careful of understanding that it's not just a, you know, great, we've got a wetland, it's come back. What are the potential implications and impacts for people who have decided to stay? And, you know, especially when that intersects with social justice and equity considerations or the voluntary nature of programs, I think that there's still a lot more work to be done in making sure that we're having kind of difficult conversations either about should we have ever built here in the first place, and how do we talk about that and compensate especially formerly redline neighborhoods that were forced to live in these low-lying areas, and how do we bring in the conservation movement and the conservation dollars in particular to actually bring the additional financial resources to the table needed to make sure that people can get into safer housing somewhere else.
All right, with our last 3 minutes, we're going to take both questions, and then I'm going to challenge the panelists to answer one or both and give us your final thoughts quickly. This is your challenge. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Katia Balaciano from the state of Hawaii. There's not enough money for buyouts. Hawaii will never be able to buy out all the properties necessary. What other tools are there that we could possibly use? Much of this conference is focused on buyouts. It can't be the only thing that we look at. We'll never accomplish it. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, great. Other than acquisitions, yes.
Yes, my question is, we've talked about buyouts and other remediation efforts in the context of public purse responsibilities, but in fact, we know that there are companies that are responsible through fraud or through damage. Fossil fuel industry, cement manufacturers, other industries that are directly, scientifically, attributably responsible for the harms that we see. What's your view on how we can hold those companies accountable and ensure that they take responsibility for the damages that they've caused?
All right, this is your challenge. So things other than buyouts, maybe as a way forward, yes? I mean, we've already mentioned maybe it's not enough to just use the programs that we have, so things other than buyouts. And how do we find, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit, but how do we think about the private sector providing funding, or think about other responsibility sources for some of these funding alternatives? Anyone want to try and take that on? Go ahead.
Maybe I'll go first to push myself to be brief. I think structural relocation is a really underappreciated option. We've seen this for, there was a great presentation in the Great Lakes about this. I know that it's something that is also being considered in places like California where you have bluff erosion and other things like that. So in the case that structures have not been substantially damaged or too old or dealing with mildew and mold, relocating those structures to another place and doing some kind of property land swap with existing public land that you know, a city or a municipality or county or state might have somewhere else, and actually just thinking about moving homes rather than demolishing them so that we don't have to rebuild them also helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the construction industry as well. So on the other point, I think that's really a question about litigation. The government has failed to enforce regulations to prevent it, and I think that litigation is the solution, but the question of who is bringing the case and who benefits and how that money actually gets distributed, I think is a huge question. I'd be really curious to know if anyone wants to dive into that, because I think it's a really important way to extract the resources needed to address the adaptation challenges we face.
I'll just say real quickly, in Louisiana, we have similar issues to what you've described in Hawaii, because down at the coast, they're just, the livable spaces are so minuscule. Nobody wants to say we're never going to build there again. So there are adaptive measures, of course, fortified construction and elevation, et cetera, and they're expensive, but if it's your only option, which sometimes it is, it is an option at least. And then on the other question, there's no doubt that fixing that problem is the long-term solution. We cannot, and we say this all the time, we cannot allow construction that's going to have us buying these people out 10 years from now. We can't afford it. We can't afford to buy out all the people who need to be bought out now. And there are some local government ordinances that I've heard about starting to come into play that make developers responsible into the future, but it's so tiny right now, and I don't even think we can know how effective it's going to be at this point.
So to the Hawaii question, buyouts are one end of a continuum of responses. So we are looking also at how we can fund, actually trying to come up with some ways to fund other mitigation measures for homeowners to take on, so that they can, if you understand that, I guess the gold standard, such as it is, would be a buyout and taking people really 100% out of harm's way, but that's both financially not possible, and it's not really what a lot of our homeowners want, because they do want to stay in their communities, and these are neighborhoods that they've built over generations. So we're trying to meet people where they are and also be responsible to the city's budget. So I think one of the things that you need to do is figure out what the other mitigation measures you can offer are. That then opens you up to a lot of other funding sources. So if we're looking at through our department of the agency that's working on affordable housing, we are looking at a small grants program that will help 1 to 4 family homeowners take on mitigation measures. We're looking at bringing in, this is a project we've been doing at the state level with some nonprofit partners at helping homeowners with resiliency audits, and then trying to come up with some funding so that they can see what opportunities are for themselves to help make themselves more resilient. These are things that will help people through the next, say, 20, 30 years, while we look longer out for longer, more permanent solutions as we hope more funding sources come online. So I think it helps for all of us to to understand this is not about just doing buyouts, because it's going to take a very long time. And even if all the funding were put in place immediately, it takes a long time for even just for one unit to go through the process and to close on the deal. So we need to come up with a whole continuum of strategies in a timeline of responses.
Eric, you get the first and last word.
Well, I mean, it's a broader question about community resiliency. We have a lot of aging infrastructure in this country. We have, hundreds of thousands of structures that were built, residential, commercial, before we had even flood insurance rate maps. And so, acquisitions, buyouts is just one tool in the toolbox. Fortunately, I work for the part of FEMA that has the ability to put the other part of FEMA out of business. If we mitigated all the at-risk structures, for flooding, wind, earthquake, we could potentially put the rest of the agency out of business with the disaster relief fund and really end disaster suffering. That's not going to, unfortunately, happen. So I just think the call to action is to figure out ways, like the Hawaii example. What tools do we have in our toolbox today? What tools do we need to help make communities more resilient, whether that's acquisitions or elevations or building smarter? It's the new construction I don't worry about as much, because if it's built to code, if it's elevated and sited properly, it's all the stuff that's out there now. It's a lot of people living in very vulnerable areas, including here in New York City, that at some point are going to go underwater when we have a future storm. So that's the stuff that keeps me up at night, is watching the hurricanes churn in the Gulf and thinking about where they're going to land and where's our next disaster declaration. So let's get out there now and figure out how to mitigate our at-risk communities and make them more resilient.
Thanks, and apologies to the poster presenters. Thank you for letting us cut into your time. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we're going to turn it over to Radley and Alex for a few moments. So thank you so much for all of this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a phenomenal panel. Let's give a big round. Thank you. And thank you to Siders and Nadia for organizing it as well. Okay, great. So I know we've already cut into your time. I'm going to be very brief, but did want to do just a real quick check-in. So we're about maybe halfway through the conference at this point, in terms of time at least, but we still have the majority of the sessions ahead of us, right? And part of what that means is that this was actually our last plenary together. We weren't able to do another plenary on the last day because we have so many exciting sessions that we need to find time for. So as a result, this is the last chance for us to sort of come together with the whole group. So in terms of check-in, just a few reminders. We had a phenomenal plenary last night. I want to give Susie a special thanks. We've been hearing from folks who attended that how meaningful it was for them. So thank you, Susie, for doing that. And then in terms of run of show, there are no special events for this evening. We'll continue to be serving the meals. We are serving lunch tomorrow, but then the conference officially ends at 3 p.m. tomorrow, just after whatever sessions you're in at that time. So very quickly, just in terms of next steps, Alex wanted me to remind about that Frontiers of Climate special issue. Keep an eye out for that. Consider submitting an article. And just more generally, we hope everyone uses this conference as a platform to continue collaborating, build new collaborations, think about reaching out to someone here who's maybe giving you a new way of thinking about things, or you think it'd be interesting to collaborate with, whether on the research or practitioner side. No official announcements yet about future convenings, but as you know, this is our third time doing it every 2 years. It's our hope that we will at some point be able to announce a fourth conference, but we're not quite there yet. With that, I think I really wanted to just pivot to giving some thanks to all the people who've made this possible, all of you who are attending, all of you who are presenting, especially our steering committee for all that they've put in, and do want to acknowledge Nadia, a postdoc here at Columbia, who stepped in and really became the third co-chair for the conference. We've never had 3 co-chairs before, and it was enormously helpful to get her counsel and contributions over the past year. Also want to acknowledge all the support that we've been receiving on the AV side, on the catering side. Please go and take time to say thank you to folks. And then especially the communications team who's there during the sessions, troubleshooting. Omar Herrera, Ned Joyner, Emily Mendez, thank you for your efforts. And finally, last but far, far from least, we do want to call Adrienne Kenyon up to the stage to thank her for making this conference possible. I hope she's here. Yeah, okay. All right, just come on up. So yeah, just really the person who made this possible more than anyone else. So huge appreciation. Thank you, Adrienne. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. We won't make you do any remarks. That's good. Thank you. Okay, great, everybody. So thank you for indulging us. Coffee and tea out there. We are going to start the next sessions right at 10:30. So move quickly and make sure you get to those sessions by 10:30. Thank you, everyone.